A Russian tank rolls toward the Kharkiv front. Then it vanishes, gone without a trace and erased from the map forever.
But both vanish on a front that has become one of the most lethal in the Ukraine war.
Ukraine now dominates in Kharkiv. All that's left is a graveyard of Russian armor and soldiers.
Russia's tanks haven't been seen in the Kharkiv sector for months,
which has made the armor that once formed the backbone of the entire Russian strategy a complete non-factor in Russia's assaults on that particular front.
That's according to the deputy company commander of Ukraine's 13th Brigade, who goes by the call sign Porokh.
He made the revelations during a March 2nd interview with Army TV, stating, "We haven't seen heavy equipment on our axis for a long time, especially armored."
This doesn't mean that Russia's armor, or what's left of it, is safe.
Though Russia isn't sending its tanks into Kharkiv, it is doing its best to amass as much armor as it possibly can behind the combat lines.
But that armor and heavy equipment aren't arriving anytime soon, and due to the 13th Brigade's actions, it's getting slowly.
Strikes on such equipment take place if we spot it in the enemy rear, already beyond the border. Porokh reveals in his interview.
This isn't necessarily easy for Ukraine to achieve.
A tank that is trying to make its way through a Ukrainian kill zone can be spotted by reconnaissance drones far more easily than one that's being held back across the border.
If reconnaissance provides us with data, we manage to fly there and strike artillery or tank positions located far from the border itself.
Let's unpack that for a moment. According to Porokh, Russia is so terrified of losing yet more tanks in Kharkiv that it's
Just what is Russia trying to achieve here? If it's trying to amass armor stockpiles, surely it's better to do so outside of the range of Ukraine's drones and missiles. Keeping those stockpiles in border regions is a dumb decision, given that Ukraine has shown again and again that it can hit these regions.
It's enough to boggle the mind.
Keep those numbers and Putin's insane strategy in mind, because we'll be coming back to both in just a few minutes.
Just one look at Russia's tank losses in Ukraine so far is enough to explain what is now happening in Kharkiv.
The war has been raging for a little over 4 years, so that gives us an annual average loss of a little over 2,900.
However, those figures will naturally be weighted in favor of the early years of Putin's faltering campaign, as Russian armor is being withdrawn all over the country.
Of course, that doesn't mean a whole lot to the soldiers who are being sent to the front lines without any armor.
Russia's tank problems have been a major source of news for almost as long as Putin's supposed special military operation has been ongoing. After Russia failed in its initial and very tank-heavy invasion, Putin thought the Ukraine war would settle into an attritional battle. Russia would win. Of course, Ukraine's drones, along with anti-tank weapons provided by the West, threw a wrench into the workings of that particular plan. And what Russia has been left doing is asking the same question that was posed by Parliament to rule by the national interest. The major problem for Russia is that its early tank losses in Ukraine were both substantial and unexpected. As a result, it wasn't long before Russia was being forced to pull from its reserves of aging Soviet-era tanks just to keep up the numbers. At the beginning of the war, Russia had 24 bases spread across the country that were full of these old tanks. By October, it had 9 left.
Russia also has to combine this depletion of its tank reserves with the fact that it simply isn't building enough tanks.
Back in October 2025, United 24 media reported that Russia had an ambitious plan to build, overhaul, or upgrade half. But there are a few problems with this strategy. For one, 1,118 tanks, which will be built or referred to teams for. Plus, as fate have already, the T-90 is no more
So what we see here is Russia ramping up tank production to record-breaking levels, at least in modern times.
But that will still only amount to about 400 T-90s annually, when Ukraine is destroying more than 7 times that many Russian tanks every single year.
The math isn't mathing for Russia.
Russia is also dealing with its existing tank stockpiles being on their last legs. That was revealed by United 24 Media in a February 26 piece,
where it reported that Russia is pulling its last meaningful reserves of tanks, predominantly T-72 Ural and T-72A tanks, out of storage. Apparently, 452 of these tanks are moving toward Ural-Vagon-Zavod, which is Russia's main armored plant.
How many will actually make it into Ukraine isn't known, but even if all of them do, the numbers we've already shared demonstrate
All of this is why you get the situation we now see in Kharkiv.
The few tanks that Russia still has are being kept as far away from the combat lines as possible.
Which is pretty much the opposite of what Russia would want its tanks to be doing. Fire support for infantry has been replaced by cowering away in bases in the border regions.
And every so often, Ukraine is hitting those bases and the tanks that they contain to provide yet another reminder to Russia.
All of this has led to Russia switching to new tactics. First, there's the replacement of tanks with soldiers. Then there's another strategy.
He describes Russia's current Kharkiv tactics, which involve trying to send small groups of infiltrators behind the combat lines.
The infiltrators are supposed to set up and wait for support. With that support, they can push on. Instead, the infiltrators enter, stop, and get shot.
Porok puts it even more bluntly, stating, their preparation for such actions is hasty, insignificant, and doesn't pose a real threat to us.
And that's about sums it up for Russia's infantry in Kharkiv at the moment. There are plenty of reports that support
Russian losses during these assaults reveal that Putin is stupidly sacrificing soldiers instead of tanks.
These numbers aren't anomalies, by the way. We'll explain more in a moment.
About a week after Demchenko's report, Ukrinform published a piece containing more comments by the same man.
We saw something similar in the period between January 12th and 18th, when Ukraine's Hearth Border Brigade reported that it had killed 100.
That brigade was supported by artillery and drones, whereas Russia's soldiers were trying to sneak in close on foot.
There could only be one winner, and it wasn't Russia.
We're seeing this type of situation all across the combat lines in Ukraine.
It's enormous, and it's the exact sort of thing that happens when Russia is forced to replace its mechanized units with small teams of infiltrators.
Even with these smaller units, Russia is experiencing enough casualties that it's crippling its own military.
Plus, it's ruining itself. On February 24th, United 24 Media reported that a staggering 1 in every 20...
which adds that the Ukraine invasion is the deadliest Russian war.
What has Russia managed to gain for all of this death? Less than 1% of Ukraine in 2025.
And nothing at all meaningful in the Kharkiv region, where tanks have vanished and Russian soldiers are being destroyed by drones and artillery.
Better people than tanks, right, Putin? Let's just pretend that the reason you're sending cannon fodder into Kharkiv isn't that you've run out of so much of your armor.
So keeping tanks in the border regions isn't working. They're ineffective there, and Ukraine is blowing them up anyway.
But there is one thing that Russia is doing that is at least smarter than what we've seen so far. It's using more FPV drones. Now there's a fatal flaw to this approach that essentially makes it the best of a bad bunch when it comes to Russia's attempts to take Kharkiv.
Unfortunately, we observe here a large number of UAVs. We have the whole assortment present as along the entire front line.
Ukraine still has the advantage in the air, Porok adds, but Russia is leaning more heavily in what are likely upgraded fiber optic drones.
Russia has indeed been upgrading its FPV drones for this very purpose. Back in September, Forbes contributor Rick Rotomittel.
Granted, that report was based on claims made by a Russian military blogger, so the requisite pinch of salt should be used. However,
These types of drones are shielded against typical electronic warfare and jamming efforts because they're fiber optic cables.
Longer cables means the drones can go deeper, which also means that they can target Ukrainian soldiers behind the combat line.
On February 26th, Euromaidan Press reported that one of Russia's fiber optic drones had managed to...
Still, the fact that the Russian drone managed to make it that far supports the theory that Russia has been extending the range of its unmanned aerial vehicles.
That's a clear challenge for Ukraine's Kharkiv defenders. It means they now have to keep their eyes open for Russia's drones in and around Kharkiv.
But here's the problem, the fatal flaw that we mentioned earlier. Drones can't take territory.
They can attack troop groupings and destroy equipment. However, drones aren't able to set up defenses, claim land, or do any of the things that Putin needs them to do.
This lack of territory taking is fine from a defensive standpoint, as we've seen Ukraine prove.
But for Russia to take Kharkiv, and it's nowhere close to doing that, its new generation of fiber optic drones automatically becomes supporting players.
People and tanks are still needed for Russia to get any real results. And with Russia clearly struggling to build up its armor reserves and its soldiers dying in droves.